Great. So as I mentioned, you got John and Tom here. We're going to get into intros just after I go over the agenda. So first, we're going to start with the intros, like I mentioned. Going to go over a little bit about the evolution of out-of-home measurement, sort of where we started and where things are today. And then I'm going to break down, I call it sort of the landscape of the out-of-home measurement, exposure and conversion environments. Talk through the methodology that Mira brought to the market back in 2014. And then I'm gonna let Tom go through a couple of campaign examples. Hopefully after that, we're gonna have a little bit of time for Q&A. So my name, as I mentioned, John Frangakis. I was one of the founders of a company called Mira. In 2014, we were looking at the world saying that the out-of-home was under-technologized and that had a lot to do, or it was undervalued because it was so under-technologized. And we felt we could bring measurement to this channel. There'd be a lot of value in doing so, and that's what we did. We were really the first ones in the industry doing performance measurement for out-of-home. About a year and change ago, we were acquired by a company called Reveal Mobile, and that's where we are today. I'm still focused on the out-of-home product, but we fall under a larger breadth of location intelligence offerings. And I'm gonna turn it over to one of our favorite customers, Tom Shea, who is one of the founders of Agile.
Yeah, thanks, John. Yeah, so my name's Tom Shea. I'm one of the co-founders and the Chief Revenue Officer of Agile Media Group. Quick background on what we do for those who don't know us. We turn last mile delivery trucks traveling the densest urban areas into mobile billboards on behalf of brands. And we've partnered with Reveal or previously Mira for a couple years now. And just being candid about the sales process as someone who leads sales, I really don't think there is an Agile Media Group without a company like Reveal. Because when and we'll get into this, but as you listen in on how we use this information to not only sell the product that we offer, all these things that have for many decades just not existed, bringing that attribution, cost per acquisition, click-through rate, things like that, to the world of physical world media, it's really enabled our business and supercharged our ability to sell. And like I said, I think it would be hard against all the other formats that we're competing against, like digital, which captures so much of media spend these days, without that sort of enablement. So very grateful to be involved. Thank you guys for the opportunity, and more importantly, thanks for the partnership.
Tom, you said something super interesting there. It is going to sound so nerdy. I had a dream 2 nights ago that I was on a campaign to change everybody from calling it out-of-home media to physical world media. And I think you just spoke to me through my dreams.
Yeah, it's jargon, right? As much as we think it's like a colloquial term of the industry, you get on calls, people call it out of house or outdoor advertising. So offline media is what I'm going with, or physical world media is what I'm going with, and I'm sticking to it.
Yeah, I once heard somebody say we are the only channel who defines ourselves by what we're not, which I wish I could take credit for, or give credit to somebody who, if I could recall. So, okay, so let's jump into it. Out-of-home media generally. Metrics in out-of-home have been focused around understanding the number of impressions that a campaign has gotten. There's always been sort of like a top of funnel brand awareness angle to out-of-home, and that's historically been the focus of it, because that was the one thing that we could measure around it. Later on, we started seeing a little bit more around social mentions, and that persists today. But historically, out-of-home measurement, the metrics that we were giving advertisers just didn't give the full picture on performance. And as I was mentioning, that's where we saw our gap for Mira, is that if we could create some of these like the digital metrics in this more traditionally offline channel, that there would be value in doing that. That's what we set out to build. But today, out of home, we can understand how it drives not just the top of funnel sort of brand awareness stuff, but also everything middle of the funnel, and we are creeping into the lower funnel as well. And because we can do that, because we can see how out of home gets people to a website and then gets them to buy something, or gets them to download an app and then place a bet, we can view out of home as sort of a customer acquisition channel and an activation channel. I think Tom's going to talk a little bit about that in a few slides. But when you can measure out of home, in the same way that you measure digital channels, or relatively similar ways as digital channels, we get to start claiming some of these further down the funnel types of acquisitions and activations. So just quick lay of the land of how the out-of-home measurement landscape looks. We break it up into these two parts. You have the exposure environment and the conversion environment, and they're connected in the middle by a device graph. And so the exposure environment, in this case, it's always out of home. This is the media, or the environment in which people are actually interacting with that ad. So for our purposes, exposure environment always equals out of home. And then on the conversion environment, that's where we start to see a little bit of variability. What we generally focus on is web visitation, in-app visitation, and in-store or location visits. There's also all these custom environments that we can look at, but the thing that sort of brings these two worlds together is a device graph. And what we're doing with the device graph is, obviously we know that someone or a group of people were exposed because of their mobile device. What if they go and convert on a laptop? Well, we want to make sure out of home gets the credit for that, and the device graph essentially helps us understand which laptops belong with which mobile devices. So to focus in on the exposure environment for a brief moment, Reveal has about 50 million daily active users in the US. So what that means is, on any given day in the US, we see about 50 million unique devices. And all of our devices have, historically, since I've known Reveal and since Mira was on its own, have always required opted-in location events. So we've been privacy compliant all along. And a lot of these more recent, the headlines that have happened more recently were less impactful, a bit anticlimactic essentially in our location data set. So we see these location events from 50 million devices across the country on any given day, and we are able to intersect that data with view sheds from a media plan, or in the case of Agile, from waypoints where those trucks are driving, and we are intersect those with time and location and the location data that we're getting, and we are able to understand a group of people that we understand to have been exposed to the campaign. So that's where we start. We start with an exposure environment. Now the conversion environments, I mentioned these. The way we understand web visitation is through a pixel that we put on a website. We can do a site-wide pixel to measure engagement, do a conversion pixel on the checkout complete page to see if it's driving people to buy something. In-app events, we're integrated with all the major MMPs. So this is companies you've probably heard of, like Kochava, AppsFlyer, Tune, Adjust, Spring. I might be leaving a couple of them out. But essentially, we're able to treat those integrations like pixels, where we are fed back the data of the different types of conversions that are taking place inside the app. So if they want to understand how out of home drove somebody to download an app, we can get all those downloaded app events. Or it gets people to place a bet on the app or search for something in the nav bar, excuse me, whatever the case may be. And so those are coming to us, excuse me, through direct integrations with their MMPs. And then location visitation, this is the most straightforward one, because we're using the same exact data that we were using to understand exposure to then go and understand conversions. Only difference now is we're tying those to points of interest. So this is what the methodology, the measurement actually looks like. When the way that we understand, somebody was exposed to an out-of-home campaign and then they went and converted to a website, that's great. But what does that tell us about, their behavior because of the exposure? So what we do is generate a synthetic control. And essentially what we're doing is we have that exposed group, and we create a group of people that look similar across a bunch of different demographic attributes, like, age and household income, presence of children, all these different sorts of demographic attributes. We then look at them from, we also look at a few technical attributes, things like, iOS versus Android, or, the fidelity of device, meaning how many times a day we see it. And then finally, geography. So I said all that to say this: we get these two groups of people that look very similar to each other across a variety of dimensions, but there's one key difference in those two groups. One of them saw the out-of-home campaign and the other one did not. So from there, already explained how we can understand if they converted to a website or downloaded an app or one of these things. So we could just look at the conversion rates between those two groups. If the exposed group converts at a 1% rate and the control group converts at a 0.8% rate, that is a 25% increase in conversion rates. And that gets us a little bit down the road to understanding how impactful the out-of-home exposure was. We then take it just a little bit further, and we look at a pre-post as well. And essentially what we're doing with these two, we call this a 4-prop study, because we're looking at control, exposed, pre, and post. So there's 4 groups there. And what we want to do is control for all latent variables we can think of, any sort of like biases in the control group, any sort of, or in the exposed group, any sorts of, time-dependent variables like seasonality or the launch of a product, anything like this. So what we do here is we're looking at the control and exposed groups and their conversion rates pre and post. And what we want to see in this graph, if you'll humor us for a second, where the x-axis is time and the y-axis is conversion rate, the two groups move along pretty similarly leading up to the start of the campaign. Their conversion rates should be pretty comparable. Then at that start of the campaign, what we want to see is that the exposed group is increasing at a steeper slope than the control group. Or said another way, our hypothesis is that exposed group's lift from pre to post, from before they were exposed to after, that lift will be greater than the control group's lift from pre to post, before the campaign and after. And if you can measure those two things, or those 4 groups, you will, that difference in slopes, the difference between those 2 lines on the right side of the graph there, that is the distilled impact of the out-of-home exposure. And so that is our sort of like gold standard measurement methodology. It's called a 4-prop study. You might have heard it called a few different things like an incremental lift analysis or a difference of differences, different names for the same thing. So sort of just, restating what we said on the last slide, there's 4 groups here, the pre-exposed and the post-exposed, the pre-test and the post-test. And we just want to see who has a bigger lift from pre to post. And that will help us understand how you distill the impact, or that will help us distill the impact from the out-of-home exposure. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Tom and let him go through a little bit about Agile, and then walk us through the study that the 2 studies that we're sharing with you guys today. Tom?
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, John. And I think just to hammer that point home, the magic is really, you think about what we do, right? We turn last mile delivery trucks into mobile billboards on behalf of brands. And it's one thing, let's use a website, an e-commerce business, for example. It's one thing to tell a marketer, hey, someone saw the truck and then converted on your website. But from where the marketer's standing, that really doesn't tell them anything of interest, because what really matters is what was the incremental lift or incremental website conversions that we got as a function of adding this to our media mix, because their media mix is going to have probably, paid social, connected TV, direct mail, out of home, and maybe other forms of out of home. So the business equation for us in solving for attribution on behalf of our clients really became, how do you prove incrementality, or what uniquely happened because this new medium got added into your media mix? You can't take credit for a conversion just because someone saw. You have Slack open, John. You're good. So you can't take credit for that conversion just because I saw a truck. That's too simplistic. What really matters is creating a clean testing environment where you have 2 groups of individuals where the only difference between them is one group has seen trucks, one has not. And between the 2 populations, all other variables are held constant, equal likelihood to have seen paid social, other forms of out-of-home, CTV, direct mail, etc. And then backing into the unique conversion behavior between those 2 target audiences. So if 1,500 people converted around a branded truck, 1,000 people converted in the unexposed environment, essentially what you'd be able to report back is your $X media investment in Agile drove 500 incremental conversions, which results in a return on ad spend of X, cost to acquire a customer of Y. And you're gonna see that shine through as we get into some campaigns here of how we sort of speak and talk like the language of a growth marketer in a space that's traditionally been only reserved for brand marketers, people focused on reach, frequency, things like that. So quick recap, because I know we have some new people who joined late. Agile Media Group, we turned last mile delivery trucks traveling the densest urban areas across the country into mobile billboards on behalf of brands. Nothing really new about advertising on trucks, right? Trucks have been advertised on as long as they've been on the road, but the change that we've made is really a willingness to pay equation, where these high impact formats were typically reserved for either they were blank, to be honest, or they were reserved for self promotion, typically in a B2B nature. So the truck delivering soap to laundromats in Soho because no one has washer dryer in unit might put some lettering on his or her trucks that says Tom's Soap Delivery Company. But what percentage of the audience that sees that can actually engage with that brand? Close to zero. Whereas if you were to flip that on its head and take that ad space, use it for consumer-facing brands, it followed that a much greater percentage of the audience could engage with that brand. And so in doing so, while it's like, that's not really an earth-shattering concept, I think partnering with Reveal has allowed us to really supercharge this and give people the attribution elements that they've grown accustomed to expecting from other channels. You look at how media dollars have shifted hands over the past 2 decades. It used to be an out-of-home, radio, TV, print, all these more traditional formats, but it's largely consolidated among 4 channels now: Google Search, Facebook, or Meta rather, TikTok, and Amazon. And for good reason, right? Those channels gave people proof of performance. You could see I put this much in, I got this much out in return. And I always look at Casper Mattress as that gold star example where they were printing money for 2 years. There was price arbitrage in digital, but now you look at the modern landscape, there's not just Casper Mattress, there's Purple, Helix, 8 Sleep, Sleepy's, Saatva, etc. So you had so much demand aggregated into a finite number of digital channels, and it was creating an environment where people were competing away the yield. And so over time, it became who can raise more venture money or operate at a loss on these channels and just outlast the competition. So from where we were standing, we were trying to find a way to give brands a way to reach and convert that same target audience by solving for the customer journey from an offline media exposure to an online or in-store purchase event. So we've worked with well over 100 or so brands at this point since we raised capital in 2021. It's been a really great experience working with Reveal. I think we're probably super users, and John can back me on this. We have attribution in these studies embedded in probably 90+% of all of the campaigns we've ever run because we lead with performance data. We put our name behind performance. So I think we could probably jump into it. You could go to the next slide there, John. So when John asked me to participate, we pulled 2 campaigns that were run in recent memory and supported by Reveal. The first one I'm going to talk about is a national gym franchise that we have as a client. And so we did a large campaign for this client. We're going to talk about the dollars and cents and the specifics, but I also wanted to give people a feel for what working with Reveal Mobile is like. And so on screen, what you're seeing is actually the readout of the information that's reported back. And to be honest, there's a lot more that gets reported back. It sort of just shares and is a nice client-facing document to show, hey, how does this all work? What's the methodology? A lot of the things that John led with on this call. And I think another thing that we found really valuable is having a third-party agnostic solution measure our inventory. Because if you look at what happened with billboards, Geopath slotted in because there was so much variance and honestly, like I'll say it, probably fraud where people were going, oh, like, this billboard's getting this many impressions, this billboard's getting this many impressions. So, instead of having and building homegrown software to do measurement, we found a lot of value, found a lot of trust from our customers when there was a third party measuring it, and we sort of removed ourselves as the middleman. It's sort of like that concept of not grading your own homework. So what you see on screen here, I'm going to try to break it down for you, is the readout of how this campaign performed for this national gym franchise. So as John shared, there is a pre-read and pre-measurement that goes on before there's any branding on any assets. And so there's this control group and this test group. Essentially, you're just taking 2 populations of individuals and seeing at a baseline, how are they converting? And in this context, it was a foot traffic lift study. So we had drawn geofences around every single sports club franchise that we were supporting. And we looked at, said, okay, from the general population, before there's this intervention effect of adding truck side media, what is the baseline conversion rate or visitation rate, we'll say, because this is foot traffic, without any intervention effect. And then as you see on the post here, you can see how those variables have changed over time as a function of the intervention effect. So the red line here is the exposed group. they had a 0.8% visitation rate pre-campaign, and then as the campaign wrapped up, a 1.72% visitation rate. So as we added this into the mix and added this incremental media into their media mix strategy, you saw those numbers increase meaningfully. Whereas if you look at the control group, that's really a representative sample of all of their other media efforts combined. And so you can see it started at 0.8%, it went down to 0.65%. So that's really the culmination of likely they probably reallocated budget or maybe scaled back on other elements. And so it really is useful in the context of showing how much value that the intervention effector in this context, working with Agile Media Group, was able to increase the conversion rate of individuals. And so as you look at this next graph, you can sort of see that in like a more scientific manner. So the blue bar represents the drop in the control group's visitation rate because they were not receiving that media exposure. And the red bar shows the lift in visitation rate as a function of adding this into the media mix. And if you look at the number 136.26%, it's really the combination of that blue bar graph and the red bar graph. And I think something that's important, and we're going to talk about this in depth when we start applying numbers to this, is you also see a confidence interval. So something that's important about this in a difference from digital advertising is it's not one-to-one. So the capture rate of mobile phones of, like, if you have 100 people that were around a truck, you're really only capturing about 10 to 15%. And so it's important that you get your campaign has enough scale and is running for long enough to get a representative sample to ensure you're getting statistically significant outcomes. And while there's 136% lift, that's what was observed. Because you're doing modeling from, let's say, 10% capture rate up to 100%, there are standard deviations and there are confidence intervals around this data, such that while we observed 136% lift, you can see here it's probably like the 95% confidence intervals around, like, let's say 80% to 190% lift. And so using a sentence and like how you would deliver that to a client, essentially you're saying this is what was observed, but just so you know, if you were to run this identical test 100 times and all variables were held constant, 95% of the recorded results would likely fall within this range. And as you have longer campaigns that capture more data, you'll start to see those standard deviations coalesce around a median. And this will make sense when we have some visuals and some graphs. But all that to say, I think that's a really important element and something that was a pretty valuable element that Reveal brought into the equation, just so that there was more candor and honesty about what was happening when you start scaling numbers from a sample size to a entire population. So getting into more of the dollars and cents of this campaign, the campaign's overall cost was $67,500. The total exposures delivered over that duration was 6.4 million impressions, and the frequency was a 7x. So we reached about 921,000 unique individuals for a CPM of $10.46. And so while it's nice to talk percentages and lift percentages, they really don't tell the full story, right? Because you can have a 1,000% lift, but if it's lifting off a very small control group, like that company or that brand doesn't have a lot of unaided awareness or just awareness in the market, percentages mean nothing. And some of our best campaigns have been small percent lifts for very established brands. So when we think about, like, going into the mind of a growth marketer, going into the mind of someone who's trying to compare how this is performing relative to TikTok, relative to Meta, relative to Amazon, and yes, I'll concede it shouldn't really be compared that way, but people have appetite for this information. The market has adjusted to demand this information. So applying those percentages to actual hard numbers, what you can see on screen here is in the unexposed group, about 6,000 people visited this sports club franchise. And of the individuals who were exposed to this branded vehicle, about 13 or 14,000 people actually went into those physical club locations for a conversion lift of 8,040 additional visits to this location. So if you were to go into the mind of someone who runs sports club franchises, essentially what we're able to report back, and I'm going to give some concessions on this, is $8.40 cost per acquisition or cost per visit. Because they're a physical location, their acquisition is really one additional body in the location. So we're able to say cost per acquisition here of $8.40. In giving them sort of like the appetite for information here, you can see there's yellow cells that are client input assumptions. So what is your average order value when you get a net new client? And what is the lifetime value if that net new client, based on their retention rate, churn rate, things like that, what is that value in terms of how you're valuing each incremental visit? So if the client gave to us the average order value of one additional body that goes in store is about $10. So the campaign revenue just during that duration drove about $80,000 in revenue, and the lifetime value of one additional body, because they sign typically a year membership, is $120 for a lifetime revenue driven of $964,000. And a lot of people look at this concept called LTV to CAC ratio. Most marketing, and this is unique, this is more like growth marketing and acquisition marketing. Most folks are looking for a 3x LTV to CAC ratio or greater, because that suggests that your marketing spend has enough margin on it that it can cover things like salary, like cost of goods sold, payroll stuff, and marketing investments, etc. So coming in at a 14.29 LTV to CAC ratio is incredible. I think some things that are important as you just like, try to analyze this information is, what exactly are we learning here? We're learning that we drove 8,040 unique individuals into the physical locations. Well, let's think about the actual core business, and don't ever forget, don't just take this as law. Think critically about the business case that you're solving for. Some of these people are reactivations, so they were part of the gym membership and they just haven't gone in a long time, and now they're reactivated, and some of them are net new. So behind the scenes and absent of this presentation, we actually did a deeper dive on this analysis to show that the cost per acquisition, that number is actually a lot higher, because more than 50% of the people who were being driven in were actually reactivations. But reactivations to them actually had its own sort of value. So always make sure that you're not just sort of simplistically taking the numbers reported to you as law. Think about the actual whole business equation of the different variables and things, so that you're putting forth information that the client's not going to go, that's impossible. Because to be honest, a 14.29 LTV to CAC ratio would be like the top 1% of all campaigns, had we not sort of broken it down further and split it between net new and reactivations. And that required some hand holding with the client sort of outside the Reveal mobile viewshed. But all that to say, I think this does paint a picture of giving people the appetite, the information that they have appetite for as they're trying to size this media investment up against other forms of paid media investments that they're pursuing. John, anything you'd add on that?
No, man, I was, as you're saying that, I was rethinking how much I like hearing, so folks present what we do in such a smart way. And I think, Tom points out something really important here. Sure, the LTV to CAC ratio might not be in a direct application for a gym, but for all of you who do deal in, for example, QSR, the average order value is a very real thing for a visitor, that they've honed fairly sharply. Same thing for, going into auto dealerships. So I think this is a great example of, using the average order value to get an LTV to CAC ratio. But then the critical thinking that's applied, the additional layer on top of that, which is, I get it. It's not an exact science for you. But Tom obviously speaks to that really well.
Yeah, and your client's generally going to know this information if they're a sophisticated marketer. And the other thing is, not everyone who went into the gym franchise actually ended up signing a membership, right? So there's all these things you need. This will get you 99% of the way there. The rest falls on you to put your thinking cap on and work closely with the client to make more sense of the abstract. And so let's so while this is reported, go to the next slide. Something that I sort of previewed is it is too simplistic if we're doing statistical modeling, taking essentially a sample group, this lived experience that we actually have hard data and recorded and reported on, and abstracting it to, okay, is this a fair representative sample of how the broader population that's out of our viewshed because they don't have location services opted in or enabled is behaving? And so when you're modeling from a sample size up into the general population, one, getting statistically significant outcomes is important, and two, telling the full story is important. So while everything I just shared is the median outcome or what was observed, when you are modeling this upward, and Reveal does this very nice on your behalf, there's also 2 standard deviations from the median in either way. And those 2 standard deviations will give you that result of, okay, if we ran this campaign 100 times under identical circumstances, where would 95% of results fall between in terms of a range? And so what you see on screen is the culmination of that. So the middle is that median, if you were to look at like a distribution curve. And then if you go 2 standard deviations to the left, you see the results on the bottom left of your screen here. And if you were to do this is actually flip-flopped. 2 standard deviations to the right on your screen would give you the results on the left. So you see a cost per acquisition of $5.38. Whereas if you were to go the other way, say the campaign, less performant rather, 2 standard deviations to the left down the distribution curve, you can see the cost per acquisition of $14.38 and an LTV to CAC ratio of 8.35. And so I think this is just really about like leading with trust, honesty, and candor. When you're taking things like sample sizes and applying statistical modeling, it's important that you tell the full story, because they might look at their numbers internally and say, hey, it doesn't match exactly what was reported. Well, yeah, that's possible because we're doing modeling, but if you're giving them the range, the logical range with this is reporting, this can fall between with a lot of confidence. You see a 93.7% statistical significance on this. It'll likely cover the actual lived reality that they achieved. And so I think, as much as that the industry strives to be one-to-one and as on par with digital as it can be, acknowledging the complexities and realities associated with measuring physical world media is important, and it's important that you share back that information.
Yeah, and I'm just going to plug again any questions that are coming up. I know we're kind of going through a lot of information quickly, and so anything that you want clarification on in your control panel there for the GoToWebinar, there is a questions tab. Feel free to send those through, and we'll be more than happy to try to get them all answered. So
here, I'll plug this too. If you want to talk about enablement and what this has done for our brand as a sale, this was a test and learn budget by that sports franchise. They came back and have done about additional $350,000 in revenue with us based on these results. And because they were able to say, hey, this is comparable across formats, we can start to actually model this and make heads or tails of whether this is something we should lean into more or lean into less. And so we're generally leading with these campaign configurations that will get them something actionable and some hard data for them to inform whether they want to lean into it more or less. And it's really not our job to be pushy or salesy, in my opinion. It's our job to be objective arbiters of information and let them make the decision that makes the most sense for their brand based on what has been observed and reported.
That's it's such an awesome story. I'm glad you added that detail at the end that I had not heard yet.
Yeah.
So thanks for that. Do you want me to move on to the second campaign?
Sure. So we're going to switch gears a little bit. That was a foot traffic footfall lift done with Reveal Mobile, right? So essentially what you're doing is you have the exposed group, control group, you're capturing mobile phones, and you're looking, you're drawing geofences around every club and looking at what percentage of each population exposed and unexposed actually went to those clubs. As we switch gears into web lift studies, you can really measure whatever you can put a pixel on in the context of web lifts. We're going to talk about conversions, but please know that working with Reveal, you can do website lift, you can do form fills, you can do pretty much anything that the company has an angle towards. And the reason I share that is not everyone cares necessarily, or not everyone's activating you specifically for conversions, right? Some people offer a service and they care, like if I was a contracting company and I had a cleaning service, for example, they really care about how many people clicked out the form to learn more, things like that. There is no checkout page. So while what I'm sharing in this context is actual conversion fires on someone's website, know that you can really measure anything that can have a pixel on it. So this campaign was an e-commerce food company. They also have a retail presence, but we kept it specifically to e-commerce in this context. And again, you see the control and test pre-read, so before any intervention effect, and the results of how that has changed as a function of this intervention effect, or adding branded trucks into their media mix. So if you go to the next slide here, you can see there is no control group movement, right? So what does that tell us? That tells us that the control group or unexposed group from pre to post, their conversion behaviors stayed nearly identical. So essentially, if you were trying to make sense of that, what likely happened is this is the only thing that got added into their media mix, because that control group is really the culmination of all of their other media efforts. And the test group here, or this red bar, is all of those media investments plus agile and plus truck side, and what changed as a function of that. So as you can see on screen here, we observed 124% lift in conversions here from pre to post. And how you would say that in a sentence: the exposed group was 123% more likely to convert on your website than folks who were unexposed to the branded vehicles during this campaign. Again, applying dollars and cents to it now, the campaign cost was $37,500. It drove about 15.6 million impressions with a reach of about 5 million. So 5 million unique individuals met with a frequency of about 3x, CPM of $2.41. Using the data shared over by Reveal, you can start to add more science to that and get people the numbers that they're looking for. Control conversions landed at about 600 control conversions, so people unexposed to the branded vehicles. And in the hypothesis group, just under 1,400 conversions for a conversion lift of 737 incremental conversions, because this got added into the media mix at cost to acquire a customer of $50.87. If you were to take the company the client input variables, which in this context were a $122 average order value, which means on the website, when someone does buy, essentially they're spending on average $102, and the lifetime value of that of $186, so some percentage of those people come back and buy more. You can see the campaign revenue drove about $75,000 in revenue during its duration, and the lifetime revenue to the brand was $137,000 for an LTV to CAC ratio of 3.66. So again, generally, I'm of the opinion if you break 2 as an upper funnel marketing tactic, you fall into the top quartile of performance. But again, breaking 3 now starts to put you into the world of outperforming things like TikTok, Meta, Amazon, etc. And if you were to go to the next slide, again, one more slide. Again, what we're sharing to the client here is the full distribution curve of likely performance. So while everything I just shared was the observed, lived reality, what we're sharing here is the range with the range of performance within which this could have fallen in, with a lot of confidence, is this 2x LTV to CAC ratio to just under 6x LTV to CAC ratio. And again, saying that as a sentence, 95%, if you were to run this test 100 times, 95% of the performance outcomes would fall within this band. So giving people that range, like I said, to acknowledge the fact that there is modeling involved, to tell the full story here. You go to the next slide here.
Sorry.
Yep, so plugging ourselves a little bit, got a big team here to support you. I'm sure this deck will make its way around. And my contact information is on the next slide in case anybody wanted to reach out directly to learn more about what we do, how we do it, how we partner with Reveal. Obviously, here's a resource as someone who has not only used the platform and the data, but I'd like to think we've sort of added a level of statistics and rigor to it that sits well with the market and has really enabled our sales channels and retention and growing and fighting for this share of wallet against these other channels. But again, not a company that I think exists without this sort of data behind it. So grateful to the whole Reveal team who's worked closely with us over the past 2 or so years that we've been in business to help us compete in the market against all the incumbents.
Yeah, and I would say Tom called himself a power user at the beginning. I mean, I think that's a bit of an understatement. Agile has certainly helped us see like how well this can be presented to their clients, and when somebody buys into what it is that we do. So I think it's a between the two of us, between Agile and Reveal, formerly Agile and Mira, it's been a fruitful partnership to say the least. Um, so do have a few questions here that I wanted to put out there that we got in through the GoToWebinar, and feel free to keep adding those in there. So number one, I think we probably answered this one. How do you make sense of percentages when percentages don't always tell the whole story? I think that LTV to CAC analysis sort of helps. I think the way Tom explained the upsampling or the extrapolation that we're doing sort of helps explain that. But Tom, with that question, is there anything else that you would have added other than what you covered on those
Yeah.
slides?
Yeah, I think something that may be a blind spot for people that sat through this presentation is we didn't give you all of the data on screen that Mira does provide. So they do provide actual, like, yes, there's a lift of X 100%, but of 100 people, what percentage actually converted in the control group and what percentage actually applied in the hypothesis group? And that becomes a number that you can apply to impressions or uniques that have been reached to actually turn percentages, which is like a theoretical concept, into harder numbers in dollars and cents terms. So while that's not reported on screen or not something that we shared, know that that information makes its way over to you as part of the case studies that you receive from Reveal.
Yep, and I think this one probably goes along with that one too. Is the data one-to-one, or how are you backing into the observed outcomes? I think that's pretty much what we just answered there. So I think you can group those two together.
I think I'd have one sort of response to help people digest that information. Think about the vaccine, and like, let's just keep it objective, this conversation. How were they able to develop a COVID vaccine that, in theory was safe for the entire world? Well, they took a sample size of a couple 100,000 of people, and they did enough testing and studying within that group to say, okay, this is generally deemed to be safe for the masses. And so I think when people have questions about like, how does statistical modeling work? How can you make this statement that this is how the broader population is behaving when you only have captured 10 or 15% of the population? These are just statistical concepts that are very commonplace and widely held. And so the things that I think stay in customers' minds are stories, right? So like, it's one thing to try to explain this like exactly in the context of Reveal. I think we found a lot of value in getting buy-in and understanding the methodology when using stories, things like the COVID vaccine, et cetera, because those are very like topical, timely examples of where this same exact methodology applies. Is the sample size large enough? And do we have statistically significant outcomes that allow us to take the sample size and say, hey, this sample size's behavior is representative of the whole population's behavior that has been exposed to these branded vehicles?
Yeah. And I think you do a good job describing, if I run this test 1 million more times and holding a lot of these variables constant, performance outcomes will fall within this range of performance outcomes. 95% of them will fall within there. And you can even tighten that band, but typically statistical significance, just for everyone on here, is we call something statistically significant once it achieves that 95% confidence threshold or interval.
Yeah, and so just another thing, like you talk about smaller campaigns or campaigns in less dense markets. Something that we've always had a lens for is when people ask what's a minimum buy with Agile, right? We design them in a way to ensure we have high confidence that we're going to achieve statistically significant outcomes. And so that takes a bit more thought and conversations with the client and a lot more analysis of the data, which I'll spare people of. But that's generally how we're able to lead with a test and learn budget that says, hey, this is the minimum amount of spend that you need to make to get something back that's going to have statistical rigor around it. And so we generally have had a lot of success doing this test and learn budget with clients. It's the minimum, and trying at the end of that conversation to pitch them on doing a much larger campaign with us, because there's going to be marginal utility gains until a specific threshold. And beyond a specific threshold, it obviously will start to drop. But like, for example, you can do 20, 30 plus trucks in New York City without achieving diminishing marginal utility. So while we start people with like 5 trucks for 12 weeks, we know there's performance gains and better numbers on the table if they do a larger campaign. All that said, people don't want to drop $100,000 plus with us the first time they ever work with us. They want, what's the minimum where I can actually get something back that I can analyze and make sense of.
Yeah, and I hope everyone on here is hearing like that. Tom is truly, for his channel, has really thought through how this stuff will apply to you as a brand, will apply to brands, and what the best practices for everyone. You hear he takes the concerns of said advertisers into account, talking about where the right size, how to right size them for the right markets. Which I think is important. And I think we've enabled him to do a lot of that, but certainly there's a lot of his own introspection that's done that. So another question, and I can answer this one, is what's percentage of campaign cost is reveal, or I would assume let's just say measurement or measuring a campaign. So we do it. Our measurement is on a flat fee, so we don't do it based on a campaign spend. And that it actually helps us control for something really important, which is we don't want to measure campaigns that are too small, because there's 3 levers in getting to statistical significance. One of them is how many observations you have so how many impressions, how many conversions you have, so how many people go to the website on a daily basis, or whatever the case may be, and then the magnitude of the lift, like how big that lift is that, are we seeing that lift to be? So those 3 things are very important, and we can control for numbers 1 and number 2 when we, if with a flat fee, because then we're not measuring the tiny campaigns, or they're sort of like the small, mid-sized to large campaigns. And so that's how we charge for it. I think a lot of our customers, particularly on the vendor side, use it as a value add or a CPM adder. But Tom, how do you guys think about where I think Agile has a unique view in that they want to measure everything because they believe in the channel so deeply. But I'll let you sort of.
Yeah, we don't break it out. We call it part of the buy. So there's no incremental fee for the data. It's part of the data. And I think just looking at my lived reality of growing this organization, I think people don't want it. You start breaking stuff out and you have all these options and permutations. It becomes the ice cream dilemma, where like if you have more than 3 flavors, it creates paralysis. So we've had a lot of success folding it in as part of the buy. To the customer, what it says and communicates is, we know what the right answer is for you. Here's one option, you say yes or no, and that's it. And there's no weird like, oh, you sort of dipped your toes and because you didn't do the full package, like, the campaign didn't go as well, or you didn't get what you wanted out of it. We've removed that from the equation. There's no separate incremental fee. We've folded it into sort of like our cost of goods sold when you think of building campaigns.
There's 2 that sort of go around the same thing here, which is, what is considered the best practice campaign length for a test and learn campaign? And is there a recommended campaign length to conduct measurement studies with moving out of home? Is it 8 weeks? Is it 12 weeks? I will say at large, across all channels, we look at, 4 weeks is kind of the standard minimum that we will look at. But I think that's a bit different when you're talking about because this is actually something we didn't really touch on. It's a fairly, niche problem to out of home to have a moving point of interest. Like, that's not common. You don't see that in other applications of location intelligence. And so that's something that it's a fairly elegant solution for that. But we do have to consider that when you have a moving POI, we want to let that run for a little while longer. So Tom, I think what's your standard campaign minimum length when you do have measurement on there?
Yeah, so people won't like this answer, but the true answer is it depends, because while John said you can control what you can control, but the reality is, if you're working with a new to world brand and they don't have good awareness in the market, that means in the control group the hits will be small, and in the hypothesis groups will be small. Maybe it'll lift a ton, but it's really not a lot of data. So unfortunately, there is an inverse relationship where you look at our brands like Glossier, they could do one truck for 4 weeks and get statistically significant outcomes, but a new to world brand will need, 5 trucks for 6 months to achieve that because they don't have a lot of website traffic and data already there. So, it's a non-answer, and I understand that, but it's the right one and the truthful one, that you do need to talk to that client, understand what their website traffic is, understand how many impressions your campaign's getting, and then do the math, look at the best practices to understand, okay, if they have this sort of website, this many website hits per day, then they need this many impressions to have a successful campaign that
Yeah,
or not a successful campaign, one that yields statistically significant outcomes.
yeah, I think we typically actually normally look at it in a set, not necessarily from a campaign length standpoint, but from a number of impressions. That's like that controls for a few things. It gives us the number of observations we need, and also going out and getting a certain number, several million impressions. You're probably not getting 1 to 2 visits per day. It's our attempt to control for these things, but these are all things that we sort of like look into before we determine feasibility or likelihood of success. Um,
Here's a quick made up math equation for people. If you have a client that's getting 5,000 daily website hits, you probably need something like 10 million impressions. If you have someone that's getting 10,000 website hits, you probably need something like 5 million impressions, right? So like there's this inverse relationship between client maturity and the impressions needed to get statistically significant outcomes. So hopefully that like is just another way to think about it, where it is a function of what their traffic is as a baseline.
And to be clear, Tom's really just referencing that inversion of the two things, not necessarily giving you the numbers that,
Correct.
yeah. So one thing to, here's an interesting one. How hard is it to get clients to agree to adding campaign pixels? So these are, so one point for clarity, these are actually website pixels. They're not ad tags, they're not going on their creative, they're going on their website. So just if I'm not sure if that's what you meant, but I wanted to make sure that that's clear. So for us, this is a varied battle. So we've gotten them from any number of clients you can think of, brands you can think of. Sometimes they require a significant amount of like approvals through the governance process in that company. Like as one example, Walmart is a very difficult one to get your pixel on their website. PayPal is exceedingly difficult to get your pixel on their website. But by and large, most companies are used to doing this because they, want to understand the effectiveness of their advertising. So, and this is one of the necessities in doing that. So that's how we've always viewed it. Actually, Tom, I've never asked you that question.
Sure.
You guys always just seem to get it done. What's your level of
Yeah.
how much do you run up against, and what do you use to sort of overcome that?
Yeah, so the good part is for foot traffic, you don't need anyone's permission, right? It's just geofences. There's nothing
Right.
going on the website. In the context of putting a pixel on their website, I think the only time we receive pushback is when you're talking about like public companies, because a pixel will give you website traffic and conversion data. And essentially, if you were to think about like insider trading, for example, they're handing over exactly what's happening on their website. And so that obviously becomes much more of a protected class because of how sensitive that information is. But to John's point, outside of those like public companies, to be honest, and honestly, even within those public companies, people have used a Google Pixel, a Facebook Pixel, et cetera, for literal decades to be able to measure this stuff. And so it's not that much of a stretch. Yes, those are much more established companies and like have regulations and controls that information sort of like has walls so that people can't access it. But generally speaking, I'd say like 97% plus of our clients have no issue implementing the Pixel and are very familiar with what the process is like. It's really, if you don't know what a pixel is, it's one piece of HTML code. It's very simple to implement.
Yep.
And there's a whole process Reveal and Mira do to ensure that it's firing correctly. They work with the client when they need to troubleshoot and stuff. So there's been many a times where things aren't firing correctly. We just introduce the team directly and remove ourselves from the middle, which is a nice sort of support plug for the team.
I think that's pretty much all we have time for here. Good group of questions. I'm not seeing anything. Let's see if anything else new came through. Now these, I think most that we've covered the flavors of questions here. Yeah. So in the final minute, I'll just say thanks again, Tom. Like I mentioned, always awesome to hear you talk about the thing that we built. You really breathe life into it more than a lot of more than most customers, I would say. So thank you for your continued partnership. So as always, it's great to work with you, and thanks for your time today.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity, and happy to help and be a part of it. Thanks for doing what you guys do.
All right, everyone. Now that that Love Fest is over, I'll let you get back to your days and
Thanks,
reach
everyone.
out with any additional questions. Thanks.
Take care.